What is the best shutter speed for landscape photography? How about sports photography? Maybe wildlife? Maybe you want to get a cool shot of the moon. Where do you start? Well, a good place might be this video, because this week I want to try to help answer the question, what is the best shutter speed for photography? Welcome to the Photogenius channel. Hi, Paul here from Photogenius. Welcome to the channel where I like to share photography tutorials, tips and tricks. Occasionally I do gear reviews. If you want to learn how to take better photos with your digital camera, please consider subscribing. Now this week's video is all about shutter speed. Now what is the best shutter speed to use will largely depend on what type of photography you're doing, but there's also two things in particular that will influence your choice of shutter speed, and that is light and movement. So in this week's video I want to talk about the relationship between shutter speed, light and movement with demonstrations and recommendations for beginners. But I also want to take a look at some advanced techniques as well, so there's plenty for everybody. Plus, as usual, lots of tips, so I really hope you're going to stick around and enjoy the video. So let's begin with the basics. What exactly is the shutter and what role does it play when taking a photo? Well, in its most basic form, think of the shutter like a door. It's closed at the moment, but if I press the shutter button on the top of the camera, you will hear it open and then close again. Now, whilst the shutter is open, the camera is able to record light. So by adjusting how long the shutter is open for, we can control how much light the camera can record. And cameras have a wide range of shutter speeds to choose from. Now, the type of shutter your camera has will depend on the camera. Some cameras like this have a mechanical shutter. Most new cameras, and particularly mirrorless cameras, will have both a mechanical and electronic shutter, and some cameras are electronic only, like the Nikon flagship Z9. Now, there are pros and cons to each, and that might be a good topic for another video, so let me know in the comments below if that's something you would like to see. So next, I want to show you how to adjust the shutter speed, and coming up, how we can select different shutter speeds to control light, as well as how we capture and show movement in our photos. Now, how you adjust the shutter speed will depend on the camera that you have and what camera mode you're using. If you're using your camera in the auto mode, you won't be able to change the shutter speed yourself because the camera will do it for you. So let's put the camera in the manual mode. That's M on the camera's mode dial. Now the camera's in the manual mode, adjusting the shutter speed should be fairly easy and is typically done by turning a dial on the top of the camera, like on this Canon T7. But sometimes the dial may be found on the back of the camera. Now for now, I'm going to select a shutter speed of 1/4 of a second. Now this, of course, is a fraction, but it's worth noting that some cameras may not show the number as a fraction, even though it is. As an example, on this Fujifilm camera, the number 4 means the shutter speed is actually 1/4 of a second. So changing the number to 2 means that now the shutter will be open for half a second. Now, as frustrating as this can be, you do soon get used to it. Now here's a great tip if you are a Fujifilm user. If your camera has a shutter speed dial on the top, like many do, a quicker and easier way to change the shutter speed is to set the dial to T, and then you can use the dial on the camera to adjust the shutter speed. The shutter speed range will depend on the camera. Turning the dial to the right will increase the shutter speed, the fastest shutter speed on this particular camera being 1/4000th of a second. Now using this Canon T7, if I dial to the left, the shutter speed will decrease, and this is called slowing the shutter down. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause here at 1/10th of a second so we can hear the shutter opening and closing. And now let's slow the shutter down to 1/4 of a second. At these shutter speeds, it becomes really hard to get a sharp image without using a tripod. And if I continue to slow the shutter down, a tripod is absolutely essential. 1/4 of a second is certainly not the slowest shutter speed. Dial to the left some more, and this is a shutter speed of 1 second. And this is 10 seconds. here 20 seconds and eventually 30 seconds. And with shutter speeds this low, we often use the term long exposure photography. Now take a note of how the camera places what looks like a quotation mark behind the number. This is to show that the shutter is open for seconds rather than fractions of a single second. Now this is really handy because when you look through the viewfinder, the shutter speed may not be shown as a fraction. So the quotation mark helps us establish whether the shutter is open here for 10 seconds or 1/10 of a second. So now we know how to adjust the shutter speed. We also see that there is a huge range of shutter speeds to choose from, so what should we be using? Well, this is not an easy question to answer, as the ideal shutter speed will depend on a few different factors, including how much light is available at the time and if there is movement of the camera, subject, or both. So let's start by looking at how the shutter speed can be used to affect how much light the camera records. So when it comes to controlling how bright or dark our images are, we have three options: adjusting the shutter speed, aperture, or ISO. These three are often referred to collectively as the exposure triangle. Now of course this video is all about the shutter speed, so I don't want to go into details in regards to aperture or ISO, but of course I've made videos all about them. You'll find a link at the end of this video. Now the shutter is a great tool for controlling light. By selecting different shutter speeds, we can adjust how bright or dark our images will be. This is referred to as adjusting the exposure. So a typically sunny day in Brisbane, aperture f4, ISO 200. Now because it's such a bright day, I'm using a very fast shutter speed of 1/4000th of a second, so the camera has less time to record light. Here's the image. Now if I go back to the same location but later in the day and try to use the same shutter speed and camera settings as before, as you can see the image now turns out really dark. We call this underexposed. Now because there is less light available, all I need to do is leave the shutter open longer, and we call this slowing the shutter down. So adjusting the shutter speed to 1/640th of a second is all it takes to get a good image on an overcast afternoon. Now using this same technique but slowing the shutter down considerably more, you can take amazing photos in low light and at night. The very first light of the day or at the end of the day long after the sun has set, using slow shutter speeds is a great way of capturing amazing images even when there isn't much light available. Now here's a great tip if you're shooting in the manual mode. Use the camera's light evaluation meter to help you get a balanced exposure. The light meter can be seen on the LCD screen and also through the viewfinder, and it will indicate the exposure level in advance of taking the photo, with this being overexposure and of course this being underexposure. So if your camera is showing overexposure, which of course means too much light, in the manual mode you can reduce the light simply by increasing the shutter speed. Now I have made a more detailed video on this that also includes how aperture and ISO also play a part. You'll find a link below this video. Now pro tip number 2, balancing the meter does not necessarily mean the image will be perfect. Sometimes purposely over or underexposing the image can give better results. If you're in the manual mode, this is easy to do as you can easily adjust the shutter, aperture or ISO to get the best results. If you're using a priority mode or the program mode, then try using the camera's exposure compensation feature. Now most cameras have an exposure compensation button. Some cameras have an exposure compensation dial. I've made a separate video all about exposure compensation. You'll find a link below. So now we know that we can select different shutter speeds to control exposure and how much light the camera will record. Now it's time to take a look at the relationship between shutter speed and movement. To demonstrate the effect shutter speed has on movement, let's use this turntable, which as you can see is turning at a constant speed. Now I'm going to show you how using different shutter speeds can affect the image. First, at a shutter speed of 1/400th of a second, everything looks sharp and clear. At 1/200th of a second, the blur is more noticeable, and by the time we get down to 1/50th of a second, the blur is very obvious. At 1/10th of a second, the wording on the matte is beyond readable, and finally a shutter speed of 1 second. So to summarise, faster shutter speeds can be used to freeze motion and capture detail, even if the subject is moving really fast. Whereas when using a slower shutter speed, anything that moves is very likely to blur. Now, of course, the amount of blur will depend on how quickly the subject is moving and how fast or slow the shutter speed is. Now, I do recommend experimenting with different shutter speeds to see how they affect movement. In this image, a shutter speed of 1/4 of a second gives a nice blur to the water, and a longer shutter speed of 1.6 seconds here capturing light trails from the vehicles on the freeway. So one of the most searched and asked questions here on YouTube and Google, and the inspiration for this video, is what is the best shutter speed for photography? So let's take a look at some common photography genres, take a look at some example images, and also talk about camera settings. Now, with landscape photography, aside from maybe things like trees and grass moving in the wind, there isn't usually any real need to use a very fast shutter speed. I would like to mention, however, that an aperture of around f11 would be a good starting point, as this will help achieve a much sharper image from foreground to background. Now, when it comes to sports photography, this is a real tricky one, because definitely some sports will require the use of a really fast shutter speed to freeze the action and the motion. But equally, sometimes blur can be a useful way of conveying and showing movement. Now, this is actually a fairly advanced technique, and it's called panning. The trick is to pan and move the camera as the cyclist goes by. Now, this same technique is often used by motor racing photographers as well. For more on the panning technique, take a look at this video next. You'll find a link below. Now, when it comes to wildlife photography, again, there is almost certainly going to be some movement of the subject, so you want to keep the shutter speed reasonably fast. How fast will depend on the subject. For static subjects like this koala sitting in a tree or this native water dragon, the shutter speed doesn't need to be too fast. However, with animals in motion, to avoid blur, here I've used a shutter speed of 1/2000th of a second for both this pelican in flight and this eagle. Now, the moon is always going to be a very popular subject for photographers. Now, a common problem with the moon is overexposure. So you end up with the moon looking like a white blob in a dark sky. Now, the trick with the moon is to purposely underexpose the image. A good tip is to not wait for a full moon. Instead, try photographing the partial moon, as the side light will cast shadows and show detail. Shutter speed for this image was just 60th of a second, but up to around 125th of a second should do the trick. So the camera settings that I've just mentioned are just a guide. The actual settings that you use on the day may depend on how much light is available at the time. I recommend experimenting with different shutter speeds and compare the results. So I really hope you've enjoyed this week's video. If you did, please consider giving it a thumbs up. It helps the videos get noticed. That helps my channel grow. Of course, if you're not already subscribed, please consider subscribing. And that is about it, other than to say thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you again sometime soon. See ya. Bye.